Okay, so I'll just give a few brief words of introduction before we hand over to our next speaker. This is Meg Jones. She is the Women and Trade Programme Manager at the International Trade Centre. She admittedly passionate about the economic empowerment of women through trade. Meg Jones led the team that established and secured financial support for the International Trade Centre's Women and Trade Programme. For the past 20 years, Ms. Jones has been working in the private and public sectors to draw attention to the significant economic and development gains to be achieved through policies and practices that enhance women's capacity to trade. Ms. Jones is the former Deputy Director of the Evian Group at IMD, a trade think tank. She has also worked for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights, prior to which she was on the Australian delegation to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Ms. Jones brings with her private sector experience gained from working in the financial markets and in management consulting. She has sat on several boards, including the Australia-Swiss Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Organisation of Women in International Trade, and was the founding president of Geneva Women in International Trade. Today, she will be speaking on the topic, Cultivating an Inclusive Culture, Empowering Women to Power, Trade and Sustainable Development. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meg Jones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure and an honour to be with you this morning, and I'd like to sincerely thank the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for inviting the International Trade Centre to speak today, and in particular to Mark Donfried and to Johan Koitzer also for inviting me in particular to be with you today. I'd like to make this as practical as possible, to make this as relevant to your work as possible. I understand we have representatives from the government, from the private sector, from the public, private sector and the public sectors, and NGOs as well, and some of you are also from academia. So interwoven in the presentation, there is something here for everybody, and if you have a specific area that I'm not touching in the presentation, I'd be more than welcome to sit down with you after this and go through the area in more detail. What I'd like to do is start by giving you an overview of what the presentation is about. I'd like to tell you a bit about the International Trade Centre itself, and then I'd like to explore this question with you of why be inclusive. By definition, cultural diplomacy implies that there's going to be an inclusiveness here of different cultures. Within that, I'd like to consider this morning the particular situation of women and the degree to which you are engaging women in your efforts at the moment, and how you might be able to better engage women going forward. And I'd particularly like to give you the reasons why that's important. I think we do work better when we understand why these things are important. So the bulk of the first part of the presentation is going to be on the development case and the business case for engaging women in cultural diplomacy. And particularly because I work at the International Trade Centre, the examples that I'm going to be giving are from the context of economic empowerment through trade in particular. The examples will be looking at national export strategies, value chain analyses, and then I want to finish on 2 points. One is to let you know about an opportunity in which you may be able to participate, you may want to participate, that the International Trade Centre is organising in November this year. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the post-Millennium Development Goal framework, which could be of interest to you in academia, because I can tell you now it's underexplored and there's a lot of opportunity there. So if you're looking at, something to sink your teeth into where you can make a difference going forward, I'd recommend having a closer look at that. To start with, please. The International Trade Centre is a joint agency of the United Nations and the World Trade Centre, World Trade Organisation, based here in Geneva. We principally established to help small businesses small entrepreneurs in developing and transition economies achieve export success. So mainly focused on SMEs, helping them integrate into the multinational trading system. And we focus on 3 groups. We work particularly with policymakers to ensure there's an enabling policy framework to help people export. We work with business organisations and associations, trade support institutions that in turn help entrepreneurs to export, and we work also with entrepreneurs at that level. So think of anything. If you're exporting masking tape from your country, to this country, to Switzerland, for example. Somewhere in there, you're responsible for making the masking tape, but the government is responsible for the roads on which the transport, on which the trucks transport your goods to market. The government is largely responsible for the airports and the ports and so on, from which your product is sent from one country to another. The government is responsible, both governments, sending and receiving, are responsible for the international agreements which govern customs duties and so on and so forth. So there's really, trade is a very complex chain of events, and we need to have harmony between, okay, the entrepreneurs on the one hand, but you're only responsible for the masking tape. You know, there's a role there for governments, and quite often in between there are institutions, whether it's a trade promotion organisation or a sectoral institution, for example, the National Union of Masking Tape Manufacturers. Yeah, it's a complex whole. And at the International Trade Centre, to ensure that entrepreneurs are successful, we work very closely with those national institutions, and we work very closely with the governments as well to look at issues like transport, like cold chain for frozen goods, like access to finance, so on and so forth. Complex whole, and we work at all of those levels. Please. So why women? Why do we need to be looking at women in the context of international trade, and what does this have to do with you? If you think about it, the Chinese have a saying that women hold up half of the sky. They're 50% of the population, they're 50%, therefore one would think, of women, of business owners in China. In China, the national rate is 25% of corporations are owned by women. That's a relatively high statistic. Even in developing countries, even in developed countries, the statistics on women's business ownership are relatively modest. Which begs the question, why? How come? Why is it that women aren't setting up businesses at the same rate as men, and what can be done about that? And why? Why would you be interested in the first place? I don't mind doing this myself if you like. So if you think about it, the reason why the International Trade Centre, as part of the United Nations, is particularly interested in working with governments to achieve the economic empowerment of women, it's because this is one way you can see trade linked to development. The statistics from the World Food Programme show that women spend about 90% of their earnings on the health, education of children, on mosquito nets and so on and so forth. So if you're looking to break intergenerational poverty, you need to put income in the hands of the people who are going to make the difference. And it's women who are heading many of the farms these days, heading many of the households, who are actually responsible for spending on the health education of children, putting money back into the community. So we need to look at the reasons why, what the impediments are for women setting up businesses, and why they're not as successful as men in some sectors, and what can be done at the policy making level, how we can strengthen those national institutions, those sectoral institutions, to ultimately help for the benefit of women entrepreneurs themselves, to help them export. So that's part of the development case around this. The business case, well, of course, women are 50% of the innovation pool. In addition to which, you probably saw the cover of The Economist 2006. It's going back a bit then, and they've since written more information on this. But the statistics also show that much of the economic growth that the world has experienced in this last decade has been attributed to women's participation in the marketplace. So we're also working with larger corporations at the International Trade Centre who, as buyers, are looking to integrate women-owned businesses into their supply chain to broaden the pool of suppliers that they reach out to. If you only ever source from 2 or 3 vendors, you get prices from 2 or 3 vendors, you get quality of the 2 or 3 vendors are offering. As you increase your supply base, you get more offers from more companies, and you can basically increase competition, which can lead to better outcomes, not only for the buyers, but also for the new suppliers entering that market, which is what I'm going to be talking about as an opportunity where you can plug in at the end of this particular presentation. Okay, some of your academics. I'm only going to go through this really briefly. It's going to be in the presentation, so you can get it offline later and go through it in detail at your leisure. Looking at this, if you follow the red lines down, that was what I was talking about: increasing gender equality, women's access to finance, women's ability to register businesses and so on, increasing their income, spending on children, decreasing poverty, and increasing economic growth. Those are the red lines. And if you go down towards the left side here, once again, it's talking about improving women's access to markets, which leads to the increase in women's income, which of course leads to poverty reduction and increasing economic growth, and we end up at the same endpoint, which is the future poverty reduction and economic growth. Now, in all of that, and I'm not going to go through each tiny little word, but if I had one thing to say to you on which part of that to focus on, it would be this one up here, where it's talking about women have better access to markets. Women have better access to markets. This is actually the most important point in this whole graph. You'll never get to that bit unless we look at this bit over here, increasing women's access to markets. Question time can start now. I'm going to ask you a question. So if you wanted to know what it is, how would you increase women's access to markets? Anybody got one idea? One idea. If you wanted to touch this area, have an impact on this area in any way. Women currently in government procurement is the largest spend in your country, most probably. In most countries, government procurement is a significant spend in the economy, multiple millions of dollars. Women-owned companies secure about 1% of that spend. Only 1%. Women-owned companies, when they respond to tenders for government, they currently only win about 1% of that multi-million-dollar business. Now, okay, you're the government, what are you going to do about that? Okay, now this is where cultural diplomacy comes in, okay? This is where you can make any difference. If something's wrong, the best way you can start to fix it is to understand what's wrong. What is wrong? So the first thing that you could do would be to organise a meeting with women business owners, with the associations and organisations that women business owners belong to. There are several, the International Federation of Business and Professional Women, SPINA, the International Women's Textile Alliance, there are many at the national level too. Call a meeting and ask those participating, why are you not winning government contracts? And then you'll find some answers. And the answers there start with, we don't know where to look. In my country, Australia, for example, the tenders are advertised in the Government Gazette. I don't know how many of you read the equivalent in your country of the Government Gazette, but it's a pretty dry read. So the thing is, most small and medium-sized business owners don't know where to look. If you want to apply, if you want to win a bid, you've got to actually participate in a tender process. Where do you get the documents? In some countries, they cost. Then there's all these questions. As many of you work with governments, it's not a simple, double-sided form. It's a book. to actually participate in the procurement process, it's actually quite a lengthy and complicated process. But see, this is where you can have an impact as well. By then, for example, which is what we're organising to do at the International ITC, is to work with women's business organisations and associations to demystify the process and talk about how you actually fill in an RFP. We'll go to questions at the end, I think. So increasing women's access to markets, the departure point is figuring out what's wrong. I just ran you through the government procurement process, but what about in the private sector? We work with women in a multitude of developing countries who make absolutely fantastic products. We ran a meeting in China in September last year, the first Women Vendors Exhibition and Forum. We brought 300 people together, buyer, sellers, trade support institutions. Women signed $14.8 million worth of business selling to companies in that context. Huge stuff. And the appetite by corporations is growing. But then we're back. So we're creating the market access opportunities. Now, what's holding the women back from really succeeding, doubling production and selling double, triple, quadruple the amount of product they're currently selling? Now, that's the question you have to go back to your constituents with as well. You go to your constituents, the business women in your community, and say, okay, what's holding you back? And then you'll come up with some issues like access to finance, information on training, I don't know how to export, all this kind of stuff. And a lot of the answers to those kinds of questions can come either through universities, which many of you are attached to, or through the government, or through organisations and associations that are set up to foster trade. So women are participating actively in the economy as business women. We've seen enormous rates of growth as a result. Front page of The Economist, better than China, bigger than India, more impactful than the internet, women's participation in the economy. Certainly the appetite for corporations is there, growing appetite from governments to source from women. And then we've got now to look seriously at what are the supply side constraints and how can we address those. And I would argue that in your work in cultural diplomacy, you take this seriously. And by that I mean every time you walk into a room or you pick up a conference like this, any conference you go to, and you see who's speaking, if you don't see 50% of women in the program, ask why. They're out there. Why is it we're currently not putting those women on stage? Why aren't they talking about their experiences in government, in business, in politics, as academics? This is something you can influence. Mark Donfried, for example, others want that kind of feedback so that they can better prepare a symposium that responds to your needs and interests going forward, and this is how we affect change. On that note, I'd like to also acknowledge that Ambassador Baptiste Cornelis comes from a country that recently elected their first female Prime Minister. We are seeing change, and she talked about some of the changes that have been affected in Trinidad and Tobago as a result under the new Prime Minister's leadership, and we do see that. We do see there have been studies which show that women, an increase of women in Parliament has an impact in areas like health, education, and in other areas as well. It's not only those kind of soft portfolios. The current head of UN Women is the former president of Chile, who used to be the former defence minister, for example. She's certainly a very capable woman, and she's held some very tough portfolios in her life. Let's just get on with this. I wanted to talk to you about, okay, what do we do? And how is ITC doing this? How is the International Trade Centre practicing what I just preached? And we do it like this. We work with governments on the development of national export strategies. What does that mean? It means that a government with a limited revenue from tax base and other sources, they have a limited revenue. How can they spend that how can they make the best use of those funds in investing in sectors they know have a future in the economy? The government can't invest in all sectors, in all areas of a country. They need to select just a few to help with the blockages in supply chains. We worked with the government of Uganda, for example. They chose 12 sectors. We worked with them and selected 12 sectors that had export potential, that were growth markets in the international economy. Then the government came back to us and said, you know what, this is great, but we're actually interested in achieving development objectives through our trade policy. We want to ensure that not only we increase export revenues, but we have an impact on poverty. We want to better integrate people from rural areas, in particular women, as beneficiaries of our trade policy. How do we actually do that? To give you a very practical example from my own country once again, I'm from Australia. Our principal export is from the extractive industries. If our government wanted to purely focus on increasing export revenues, they would put all of our taxpayers' money into developing the infrastructure, the ports, the railways and so on around coal, iron ore extraction in Western Australia, where we've got about, I think it's 5% of our population live in that area. So our government would wholeheartedly sink all the finances into building infrastructure around, getting those natural resources out of our country to increase export revenues, and they would promptly lose the next election. Because the voters and the people live on the East Coast, 80% of our people live over here. So governments have to take balanced decisions, even in trade, even when they're using taxpayers' money to figure out which sector that they're going to foster export in. Is it going to be coffee? Is it going to be manufacturing of textile, of garments, or is it going to be coal? To think about not only export revenues, but the impact on the people that are affected by those decisions. And this is what Dr. Supplier was talking about in his opening remarks to you. He was talking about not only policy choices, but having a really good look at the impact of those policy choices. This is an oft overlooked part of trade policy. And this, in your work on cultural diplomacy, this is where you can have an impact. The policy decisions are made at the cabinet level, it's done. You, however, talking to your people in your network and your constituents, can look at the impact. What impact is that having on people positively and negatively? Let's just take a look at one sector here. To come up with a national export strategy, you have to do what's called a value chain analysis. Very simply, in coffee, for example, that takes you through, we're growing coffee trees here and we're exporting coffee over there. There are several processes in between. You grow the trees, you pluck the cherries, you wash the cherries, you package them for export, and off they go. Women, 80% of women, our studies show that 80% of women work in this harvesting area, growing the trees and plucking the fruits. There's the actual cash. Where's the the money in this one, it's at the export end. Women work about 10% in the export end. So even when you're thinking about developing an export policy in one sector, you need to look at who's working in that sector. Men and women don't work 50% in the agricultural sector, at the farm end. Men and women don't work 50% at the high value end where the actual export takes place. They do very different jobs at each stage of the value chain, and that's something we also need to look very, very closely at. Because on our website, for example, I think many of you have this one, intrasend.org/women and trade. We have a video there where we filmed the women we're working with in several countries. And the video there on Burundi, they talk about the fact that it's not that they're looking for equal pay for equal work. They're looking to get paid. They don't get paid at all. So it's actually not only always about jobs. The work is there. But if you're not getting paid, why would you double output if you're not getting paid for it in the first place? You know? So that's why it's when you read these words on paper about jobs and about this and about that, it's, you know what, you don't go to work, I don't go to work to not get paid. You know, it really is about the income. So if you want to really look at the impact of any policy, look at the impact on women's incomes, women's earnings, either as employees or as entrepreneurs. We can all work harder, but what are we actually getting from that? And I would say to you that the proof of the pudding, is this policy working or not, is looking at the impact on women's salaries in particular. And especially if your focus is on linking trade and development. If you want to achieve development outcomes, women spend 90% on the health and education of children, breaking intergenerational poverty. You have to make sure those policies are impacting women, not only by creating more work, but by creating more income for women as well. So if you take nothing else from this particular seminar, think about whatever you're doing, what's the impact on the women's incomes, on their earnings as employees and as entrepreneurs. So how do we do that? Fine, we do this through national export strategies. I spoke about value chains, and for those of you who are from least developed countries, then I'd be happy to talk to you about the Enhanced Integrated Framework after this. It's a mechanism through which LDCs can access funds to build infrastructure around ports and railways and so on and so forth, and we're doing a lot of work there to ensure that women as well as men benefit from that work. And in the centre there you have Pascal Lamy, who's the Director General of the WTO, surrounded by the wonderful woman who managed to persuade him that this was an important focus of the work. I spoke to you about, I've got a couple of minutes, yeah. I spoke to you about the supply side, women entrepreneurs. Just to draw to your attention the fact that the buy side is certainly, the appetite for sourcing from women entrepreneurs is certainly there and growing. The International Trade Centre with partners, we put together the global platform for action on sourcing from women vendors. What this does is brings together buyers, sellers, trade support institutions to help women link to buyers and to transact business. We work specifically with Fortune 500 companies and others that have what's called a supplier diversity program. That means they're actively looking to source from women entrepreneurs. There's a growing number of companies that have adopted these policies and practices, and we had a meeting with them in 2010, and we asked the companies, okay, supplier diversity, sourcing from women-owned enterprises works very well in North America. What's your biggest challenge when you try to push this policy out to your subsidiaries? In global value chains, and they said their biggest problem was finding women business owners outside of North America. And I mean, coming from the International Trade Centre, we have database on database of companies that we work with that are women-owned that would love to sell to some of these corporations, which is why we set up the Global Platform for Action on Sourcing from Women Vendors. We had our first meeting last year that I touched on before in China. Our second meeting is this one. I handed you these cards this morning. This meeting is taking place in Mexico City on the 6th and 7th of November. It's our second Women Vendors exhibition and forum, where once again we're bringing together these companies and women entrepreneurs in the sectors which are indicated on the flyer there: coffee, textiles, clean and green technology, construction and mining, IT, agribusiness, and in trade facilitation. So I just spoke about that. Now, the other area I wanted to touch on, because many of you are academics, is this post-MDG, post-2015 development agenda. This is life after the MDGs. We've had the Millennium Development Goals. We still have the Millennium Development Goals from the year 2000 to 2015. As you know, the international community agreed on 8 priorities. MDG 3 is about gender equality and the empowerment of women. And what we need next time is gender equality and the economic empowerment of women, because through the economic empowerment of women, you get spending on health and education, and you get it from the women themselves, and you get the kind of outcomes you're looking for. Which is why in your work, if you end up moving into an area where you're working in development economics or what have you, or if you're working with the government to set up programs or whatever, in these days, now that we're all looking at we're becoming much more results oriented in our work, the indicators of success, the indicators we choose to use for figuring out whether or not we've succeeded, are becoming increasingly important. And so in your work, you'll probably start to see success indicators featuring somewhere in your work. And I would advocate once again that in those success indicators, you look for the impact on men and on women, and to the fullest degree possible, you look to determine how your work is impacting the incomes of women. Thank you very much.
So does anybody have any questions? Yeah, if you just want to go.
My name is Karima. I'm from Morocco. Actually, it's not a question. It's a comment to the question you have asked about how can we ensure access of women to markets. And I would like to give just a little experience that happened in Morocco, not particularly related to business, but it is applicable to across sectors. And I would like to emphasize on the role that civil society can play in advocating for equality of women. Civil society in Morocco has advocated before public authorities and also the parliament to integrate gender-based approach in government policies all across the different sectors. And more recently, they have advocated before the parliament to have a women's budget, a gender budget. And the parliament has just voted for a gender budget so that they can do programming in their public policies in favor of women, whether in politics or in business sector. And they have started with something that we called quota, although it is viewed by some as non-democratic, but it is the first step to guarantee equality of chances for women. So we have a quota for parliament. We reserved a national list for women, and we imposed it by law so that public powers would guarantee seats for women in the parliament, in local governance, and also in businesses. You know, sometimes if there are no laws that impose on public authorities to do that, whatever the work that you are doing, there is no really public will from those authorities to do. So there is room for civil society. When I see civil society, it's businesses, NGOs, private sector, political parties and syndicates to advocate for equality of women. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's directly on topic in terms of cultural diplomacy, because we're talking about inclusiveness, and that is the kind of result you get from an inclusive dialogue from civil society. And the Kingdom of Morocco, in particular, is a leader both in the region and in the world with some of the outcomes you've managed to achieve, and particularly in terms of allocating budget to these very important areas, because quite often governments will change the document. Oh, now we're looking at gender, the environment and poverty. Right, done. But unless there's an allocation of budget to support the work, then you're not going to see the kind of results that Morocco is indeed seeing in terms of boosting the economic empowerment of women in trade.
Okay, are there any other questions for Ms. Jones? Okay, if we just go to the front and then we'll go to the middle.
I joined last year a microfinancing, actually two microfinancing websites where we can put $20, $50 on small community projects. And I must say that my small portfolio is strongly biased towards women projects, and after 1 year the default rate is almost zero, sensibly better than the average of the whole portfolios.
Yeah, it's true, certainly women, the default rate is significantly lower, and yet women can't get access to commercial credit. This is one of the tragedies that microfinance has proved many times over that women are creditworthy and yet they can't get access to commercial loans, which is a problem for the women that we work with, for whom companies would like to increase their purchase orders, yet women, if they're restricted to access to microcredit, they're not able to invest in the necessary infrastructure to gear up, or more land, or what have you. Just also on microfinance, one of the less recognised impacts of the global financial crisis was actually on women's access to microfinance. When the larger financial institutions were looking to cut budget, this was one of the areas that got cut back, most unfortunately. So even though it's been proven to be successful, the movement towards supporting women in opening up commercial lines of credit is slow, and microfinance has suffered also.
Okay, and I think we have 2 more questions and then we'll have to wrap up, okay?
My name is Alia Tsai and I'm from Kazakhstan. And I have 2 questions or comments in a way. When, like in Kazakhstan, when there is elections, for example, and when I see in the, candidates, one of them is woman, and her platform is very, very crappy. She doesn't apply anything. And then I have a man who I know can do something and can have an impact on women empowerment, And I would go for a man, because I don't want to vote, for women just because she's a woman, And here it comes to my question in how the ITC and how in your projects you're working with the women who are in power in governments already, and how you can support the political, I'm international relations, political scientist, so how you can support the access also, not only for business, but also for the political power, the political empowerment of women who can make an impact on policy making in their countries. And that brings me to another question, where how you, as an ITC in your project, ensure that there is a framework of policies that would allow women to work more, or to have more access to business. I'm talking about these social policies like maternity leave, or social welfare, the support for women, with kids, or like the availability of kindergartens. If you have 5 kids and you don't have a kindergarten in the country, how are you going to work? You're not going to work. You have to stay with your kids, right? So there are lots of things related, I guess, to your project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Certainly the issue of who to vote for comes down to competency. There's no doubt about that in my mind. How you build competency, however, is, I think we could look again to the example of Morocco, where certain quotas were put in place in some areas to get women to be familiar with how Parliament operates. That's foreign to most people. When you look at which women go into politics, when you look at their background, for the most part, they're business women. For the most part, they actually come from a business background, which is another reason why supporting women in business and trade is very important, because this is the fertile ground from which future leaders of the country are drawn. They have an understanding of finance, they have negotiating skills, they understand relationships that impact on both trade, and in some degree through their own personal experience, usually the kind of issues you were talking about. I loved being a full-time businesswoman, but gee, it was hard because there weren't enough kindergarten places available. That kind of is that women and men bring to governing countries. So certainly, I think the example from Morocco in terms of quotas is one way to go. Fostering the idea in the minds of businesswomen that they could go into Parliament is another thing. The ambassador today is a clear example of somebody who wasn't thinking politics, and then now she's ambassador in Geneva. And she's made that transition. In terms of ITC's policy, as I mentioned at the outset, we're focused on helping small and medium-sized enterprises succeed in export. We're not focused on building kindergartens, and we're not focused on the social areas. In that regard, in the projects that the Women in Trade project runs, we look to partner with institutions on the ground and others who can provide those services. We don't do finance either, so in our coffee project in 5 African countries, we partner with a financial institution who can bring that to the party. So we do that. And more broadly, the International Trade Centre adopted a gender mainstreaming policy in 2011, which now means my colleagues at work must look at the impact, the inclusion of women in the development of their projects, and the impact on women at the end of the day, which has actually fostered the kind of dialogue I was talking about very quickly one example. We do projects in rural Ethiopia, for example. I was there 3 years ago with one of the donors, and we were looking at a field where a nursery, small plants were growing. And the woman was encouraged to explain how this worked. And she said, "Good morning, my name is Martha and I run the nursery." And her husband said, "Good morning, my name is Martha and I run the nursery." And then the interpreter said, "Good morning, my name is Martha and I run the nursery." So it went like this. And the reason it went, wife, husband, interpreter, was because in this particular cultural context, she was not able to speak in front of the men of the village, So that made me think about who did we send as an organisation to actually do the inclusive, consultative process that kicks off all of our projects. I mean, to what degree do we really understand what these women in that village wanted? Because I can tell you now, I don't think we spoke with them. I think we sent the wrong I shouldn't speak so frankly, but really, we need to think about who we send. If you want to have the input from women in the village in specifically those kinds of cultural contexts, you need to send a woman and a man, potentially, but certainly a woman as part of the mission, and preferably one who speaks the local language. This is very important, and this is one way that the development community can be informed by the work you're doing in cultural diplomacy. It's very important. What the women wanted, it was an amazingly successful project. This nursery was next to this huge field. This was the new extension, and we had, the ground was now like that. The village was over there, and the lake was there, and we were putting in an irrigation pipeline to irrigate the field. Great. Where was the tap? Where was the tap? We just doubled the distance that these women had to walk to go and get water from the lake, because we just, ploughed up the field to grow this new great crop that was going to make them a lot of money. But then it's the women who do most of the work, and we just doubled the length of the distance they had to go get water. So we've doubled the work, we've doubled the distance, taking time out of their day to do that. And if we actually sat down and asked them, "What do you want?" they might have said, "Gee, you know what? A tap at the end of the pipe would be nice." But this is what I mean. We have to send the right people to do the right job. And in terms of cultural diplomacy, this is very important. It's very important to consider the actual circumstances, not what's written on the paper as a great project idea, but to think about the actual people on the ground and how we're going to harvest their input. Thank you for your...
What I would suggest now is, because I saw a few more hands, as Miss Jones has already said that she was happy to speak to participants after a lecture, that we would round it off there and maybe just give one last round of applause to Miss Meg Jones for her presentation. Thank you.